one. I think definitely have a quorum. So we're ready for one first. We'll see. It comes in a moment. So good evening, everybody. It's 7:31. June 27th, 2023. My name is Paul Bohm, and I'm the chair of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force. We have a new Zoom Plus system operating here. In the room here, we have an OWL system, so anybody on Zoom will see one screen, and the OWL will pick up anybody talking in the room. And gonna be fun. The agenda for the meeting has been posted on the task force's webpage in compliance with the Massachusetts Open Meeting Law, and as part of a packet of material to be used or discussed during this meeting, so you will have access to the meeting packet. This hybrid meeting is being recorded on Zoom and will be accessible on the town's YouTube site. Copies of all the materials to be discussed today, including the presentation that we're here, were previously posted on the webpage. Any additional material introduced tonight will be posted after this meeting and will be available on the task force webpage as well. So I'll start by confirming that our secretary clerk, Rich Feely, is not present at the moment. And so is there a volunteer who will take minutes for this clerk booth? We'll take minutes. Thank you very much. So I'll start by calling the roll. Carrie Flood.
I'm here.
Court Booth.
Here.
Kurt Herman.
Here.
Gary Kleiman.
Here.
Pam Hill.
Here.
Rich Feely. That might be his coming in the door. We'll see. Carl Seidman. Here. David Ropey. And I'm Paul Bohm. We're here. So it's great to be together again. I'd like to also welcome others in the room. We have Megan Zamudo and Chris Carmody from the town manager's office. Here's Rich Feely. Well, again,
You're off the hook for minutes tonight.
Nothing important was said yet.
Good.
Why taking notes?
Just fine. Court just
Court
volunteered.
will be taking notes unless you want to fight for the privilege. I want to acknowledge that Rich Feely is joined us, so everybody on the task force is present. Also want to welcome Terry Ackerman, our select board representative.
Thank you. And I'm traveling, so it's a pleasure to be with you. And I just want to remind everyone to please speak into the microphone because it sounds a little iffy.
I think the only microphone operating is the OWL in the middle here.
Okay,
How's my volume now?
you're pretty good, Paul, but some of the other people are a little iffy.
Okay, we'll have to speak up a little bit
Thanks.
to the OWL. Also want to welcome Pam Rockwell from the 2229 Main Street Oversight Committee, members of the public on Zoom, members from SKIO. I see Mass DEP, Gary Waldeck, so Karen Interberg from EPA. So welcome everybody to the meeting. I also want to especially welcome, I'm pleased to welcome Nancy Nevins, Catherine Boston, and Ariel Newman from RU Associates. RU is the town's TAG consultant, technical assistance grant consultant. We have a Mass DEP TAG grant. And they work on what I call the site reuse risk project, but they'll define that in their own terms as they present their work. That's part of the agenda today. I just want to put up the agenda. Go through that briefly. So there's just a little old business I want to go over, but there are two main parts to today's meeting. Never bother. So RU is going to brief us on their work, and that is, as you remember, that's sort of part of one of our work streams, which I'll call the safety risk work stream, and they will be assisting the task force on that. And so we'll have a brief discussion after their presentation on that. Also want to sort of introduce a document that Carl Simon sent to us at the end of last meeting as part of your meeting packet, and that's one of our work streams is on operations and economic analysis, and we put together a work plan, and at least tonight I want to kind of look at the template of that work plan, because I think it's a very useful template. If we have time, I want to get into some of the details of that discussion. But I'll say more about that in a moment. We have a site visit tomorrow. I want to talk a little bit about that. I have some material to give you about that site visit. We have minutes to approve and public input, and hopefully we'll adjourn by roughly 9 o'clock, but I think we're going to maybe go a little bit further than that. One thing I do want to discuss, I want a little bit of reminder, a little bit of a recap of where we've been over the past few meetings and sort of where we're going. I describe what we're doing now, sort of the introductory stage where we've organized our activities. We are getting familiar with and getting introduced to others who will assist us in progress of their own work. We've talked with the folks of SKIO, EPA's redevelopment consultant. We've talked with Anita Markarius, the town council, who's going to sit on the legal work stream. Today, we're going to be talking to the folks at Brew, assisting on the risk and safety work stream. So this will kind of wrap up. So the first phase of our activity. We have talked about in subsequent meetings, getting more into the meat of how each group, each work stream is planning their work and having discussions around that. I want to talk about that more as we get into the future meetings, but it's the intent as we go forward to structure an agenda around one or several of those work streams. I'm putting together the agenda thus far. I'd like your input from the task force on the next agendas. We have 2 meetings in July. I think we're going to focus on the work streams. There's some logical pairings of those work streams. At least some logic to it. We have the legal work stream and the post acquisition issues and the legal issues involved in that. So the economics and operations and legal work stream are 2, and then we have the safety and risk work stream and the reuse work stream, and the natural overlaps between those. So that it may make sense to start off by fashioning an agenda around those pairs. But I want to discuss that a little bit later, and so I just want to let you know so where I think we decided we're heading from this point after this meeting. Any brief comments on the overall concept of digging into the work from this point forward?
Seems sensible.
And whether we need 2 meetings a month or one, we'll have to see how it goes, whether we need all the time to October 31st of 2024, we can get it done earlier. I know the members of the select board would love to see it earlier. I'm not promising anything, but we just don't know what the pace of our work is going to be. We have a lot of work to do.
I think a lot of that will have to do with what the individual work groups are able to, assimilate on their own, and when we need to come back. So I would say for July, we plan on having 2 meetings, but maybe not in August. Get our feet more a little solidly on the ground.
Let's take it 1 month at a time. I've scheduled these all out. I think you have all calendar invites. Somebody suggested that. And one is in the morning, one is in the evening. We've agreed on that. So let's go through July, see where we are on the pace of our work, and then decide for that going forward. Okay, so that's kind of the old business. With that, I want to introduce one of the main topics for this evening, and that is the folks from Brew Associates will be talking to us about their work, and I know that they have a discussion, a presentation. I think I have that on my machine, and maybe that's the best way.
I have it on my drive too.
Oh, God. I don't know if I have any USB ports left. If it hasn't changed, let me see if I can.
Also emailed it to you, that helps.
Wait, I think I have it.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Yeah, up on the top.
Actually, yeah. Oh, yes,
It's
here.
the first
Sorry. you all see that?
I think it's sharing your folder.
Push back. It's very friendly.
Chairman, stop sharing. Okay, better. Hopefully everybody on Zoom can see this. Okay. Okay, you just say it.
Take it away.
I'll introduce, I don't know who's leading this. Nancy,
Yeah, I'll start.
just tell me what to push the button and I'll.
Sure,
I will
sure.
change it.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, to meet everybody in person. Got a number of phone calls and Zoom meetings, so it's nice to see folks face to face. We have a very brief slide presentation to introduce you to us and to let you know about the scope of work that we are approved to complete and to give you a big picture about where we're going. So we're very excited to get started. We have not seen the site, so we look forward to getting out there tomorrow and just really start digging into some of the site documents and the history. So our work is very much at the beginning, but we look forward to working with the town on this important project. So, yeah.
How are we doing on volume for those? Terry, can you hear?
Pretty good. Maybe put it, can you put it a little closer, maybe?
I can try to speak louder.
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Terry. Okay, we can go on to the first item. Thank you. So we'll start with some brief introductions of the routine. Katie, myself, and Ariel. We'll then discuss our currently approved scope of work as well as our what we see as a big picture future scope of work, and then just open it up to questions from the team. So to start, I'm Nancy Nevins. I'm a licensed site professional in Massachusetts. My background is in both environmental science and geology. I've been in environmental consulting for probably since 25 years over. It's probably closer to 30 at this point. And my background has been largely doing site investigation work with a fair amount of litigation support work as well. In more recent years, I'm working as an LSP, and some of the portfolio of sites I've worked on have included public involvement sites under the Massachusetts contingency plans, where my client is the PRP working with the community on issues around site contamination. I've also worked with community groups where there's a site in their community and there are some issues about concerns about health risks. So I've worked both sides of the fence, and currently the operations manager in our Burlington, Mass office, who is, I should have said, a full service environmental consulting company. We have 12 offices, and we are all working in the Burlington, Mass office, 20 minutes down the road. Katie?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Boston. I'm a principal scientist and human health risk assessor at RU. I got my undergraduate degree in geology from Colgate University. Right after wrapping up at Colgate, I started to work at RU. Initially, I was wearing the big boots and the gloves, going out and collecting environmental samples, playing outside, and quickly I got roped into doing human health risk assessment work. So I went back and got a master's in public health degree from Boston University. My degree there was focused on toxicology and environmental health. After finishing that program and, wrangling some kids, I sat for the DABT exam. It's kind of like the bar for attorneys, showing proficiency in toxicology, pretty rigorous exam to pass. I was very, very pleased with 2 young toddlers to pass that exam. And really one of my passions at RU is trying to creatively communicate complex scientific issues to a lay audience. I think that there's very often this disconnect between the scientific community and the legal community, regulatory community, developers, the general public. So I really look for creative ways to communicate. And I also do some expert witness work, which I just think is a testament to some of my abilities to communicate in a potentially contentious environment. And I'm pleased to be here today with Ariel.
Hi, I'm Ariel Newman. I'm a senior scientist and human health risk assessor at RU. I actually grew up in Concord, and I got my bachelor's in environmental science from UConn. And like Katie, worked in the field for a little bit before deciding that I wanted to go back and get my master's, which I did in environmental and civil engineering, and focused on human health risk assessment and epidemiology. I have done a lot of environmental remediation to facilitate site cleanup and human health risk assessments surrounding that to kind of help facilitate that redevelopment. And in Massachusetts, I have done a lot of work with the brownfields redevelopment, and specifically brownfields tax credits, and kind of being involved on all sides of them.
So you've been hearing about Starnet since you were little.
Yes, I have.
But Gary Newman was never approved in any of the original. Oh my God, this.
So it was one of the reasons I was interested in environmental science to begin with. So, well, so purely coincidental.
Okay, so as most of you know, we are working under the Mass DEP tag grant, and the way I see our work is sort of in 3 phases. The initial one is to evaluate human health risk under future scenarios once site cleanup has been completed. Second is to communicate that to the board, the town, the community, and to prepare a written human health risk assessment based on reuse scenarios. And then the third component, perhaps one of the more important ones, is communicating that and engaging the public, and in a way that we can help educate them on issues associated with potential reuse of the property. So to start, we have three tasks that have been approved today: document review, site visit, and engagement with key stakeholders, as well as a draft reuse human health risk assessment. So we are really just beginning our work yesterday and today. So our first task is to understand the technical documents that have been prepared to date. You know, we have read the ROD, are familiar with the RIFS. We've certainly skimmed the human health risk assessment, so we have some familiarity, but it's really to dig in a little deeper and get a better understanding of some of the site issues and areas of interest. And also to become familiar with some of the other documents that are being prepared by other groups. Once we do that, tomorrow we plan to do the site visit, so we're really beginning that phase of our work and continuing engagement with the town in this task force. And then the third piece is the draft risk assessment, which I'll pass on to Katie. Can you tell us a little bit more about?
Thank you. And I think Nancy's, yeah, thank you so much, Paul. So as Nancy said, we're still in this, data collection phase, and I know Ariel and I are really excited to get our hands on the data, and to start to understand, the site in a little bit more detail. And so, these are some of the nuts and bolts of the way that we were anticipating conducting this draft reuse human health risk assessment. So we're anticipating using a combination of specific site data and also potentially establish goals in conjunction, depending on the way that the data shakes out, the way that the data is looking. We're planning on screening various reuse scenarios, working in concert with SKIO and also, potentially, other input. And we're going to be calculating risk estimates associated with future receptors that are associated with each applicable scenario. So you can see this matrix kind of building out and getting bigger and bigger, multiple scenarios, multiple receptors, different areas of the site. And so, we're also going to be assuming in certain circumstances that cleanup goals, are attained, work is in progress in certain areas. And one of the really key elements of this, you know, from our perspective that we think would be most useful, is communicating, you know, relative risk, in kind of digestible terms, communicating uncertainties that are inherent in the risk assessment process and associated with the data collection, data gaps, and you know, just really taking a close, you know, microscopic look at the data. And also highlighting the conservative nature of some of the assumptions that are baked into the risk assessments as part of the regulatory process, derivation of toxicity values, you know, that are really often very, very conservative assumptions that a lot of people don't realize are just baked into that risk assessment process. So all of this is a lot of fancy math that we're gonna have to try to translate and make digestible, you know, for a wide variety of, you know, of consumption by, you know, by the general public and to inform decision making. So I know Ariel has a lot of great experience trying to boil down complex math like this. We have an example next.
Yeah, can you advance to the next slide?
Do you want to take questions as you go?
Can I interrupt with a question?
Well, I was gonna ask, you want to take questions as you go, or you?
And we're stressed.
Okay.
Yeah.
One question.
Can you expand on what you mean by emphasizing and highlighting relative risk as opposed to absolute risk, or how do you mean it?
I think some of it is, so the results of the risk assessment are going to be expressed, you know, as non-cancer risk and cancer risk. And so, you know, relative to, you know, risk thresholds. So explaining kind of the difference between 1 in a million risk, you know, 1 in 100,000 risk, and what that really means, and what's practical, and you know, what most people feel comfortable with, in terms of, you know, regulatory definitions of acceptable risk. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. It has, these terms have fluid meanings.
Yeah.
You use relative risk in a different way than I was thinking of it.
Oh, okay.
3% higher than 1 is 3. That's relative. 3 is the number of bodies. That's the absolute. It's the relative and the absolute risk in terms of the number of possible bodies. That's one. There's also very, as you probably know, having communicated, fluid meaning of the word risk.
Yes.
And 1 in a million is too high if you do 1. And
Yeah.
all of that. That's my role here. So that's why I was asking
I see.
what your thinking is behind the use of that particular term. Thank you.
Let me just
We
introduce.
could go into this more later. I
Well,
think.
Yeah.
Three things, we have, we've separated work streams, and so the two folks working on this work stream are at the corners, David Ropick and Kurt Herman. And they will,
Can you say their names again?
David Ropick,
David,
Okay.
Kurt Herman. In that far corner, and so in between these meetings, we'll probably be chatting with them, and they're so the major initial users of the information. I will say that this topic of how to communicate risk and when we use numbers, we have a lot of discussion about that, and we'll table that. But I do have a question on the first bullet. The use of site data, this, you know, some of the conversation we had earlier on. The numbers are evolving, the work that was done to define the existing contamination many years ago, those numbers are relevant but kind of moot
Yeah.
right now because things are getting cleaned up, and then on the far end, we have cleanup goals.
Yes.
In between, we have data that are being collected right now
Yes.
as a process. So which data are you after, and how are you gonna?
Great question.
How are you gonna come to the bottom line here?
Good. And I think really the answer is until we start to dive in and unpack it all, we're not gonna know the best approach, right? There might be certain circumstances where we look at it and we're like, hey, it's gonna be way too complicated to try to pull out. Pull out data sets that we think, you know, might no longer be present at the site. Guess what? Even if we include them conservatively, and represent it as kind of a worst case scenario, it's probably simpler to streamline the process. Let's just take that approach. So that's just an example of, until we start to really, you know, get our hands on the data, and understand you know, understand what's been removed, what's still reflective of current conditions there. We unfortunately can't look in the future and say like, oh, it's gonna make more sense to apply the cleanup goal here versus use the actual site
Yeah,
data.
And I think
It's a key question. We'll have to unpack as we go. I will say one more thing. Tomorrow's site visit. I don't want to speak for Bruce Thompson, but they are chasing down the contamination so that they meet the performance goals. You have to assure yourself that they're doing that properly. So if that's the number you're comparing to, that's fine. If it's not, it's some other number you have to understand that.
I think there's one level of understanding that we're going to have as a committee and members of the committee that are following along this dialogue. But at some point, we have to convey our decisions to the public with some level of comfort and trust.
And I see us breaking this into a lot of little pieces, right? So we're not gonna look site-wide at all the data, if we start at each of perhaps the areas of interest, or perhaps one of these reuse areas, and start to break it down into manageable pieces in terms of what's being removed, what's staying, are they collecting additional confirmatory samples, is it best to use those? Is it being filled with 10 feet of clean fill? What do we, you know, each area is going to have its sort of reuse specific approach to evaluating risk. Obviously, it's all going to be pulled holistically into one bucket, but I think that's the way that we need to manage it, perhaps following the footprint of the excavation, because that's the more significant piece of the remediation in terms of what the residual exposure will be.
Yeah.
So I think it's good, it's,
Because all but maybe one or two areas, redevelopment areas, probably will be fine, they just.
so I think that if we could get our hands on a database as well, if we could have the master database that maybe break down data by sub area, it will streamline our work and it will give us a picture of where we have gaps. Have they adequately characterized areas where they say there's no risk? Do we need more information in another question? So I think if we could get that database, it'll fast track a lot of what we do.
Yeah, it's a good question for tomorrow, but I think our immediate client is the select board. So we're making recommendations to the select board, so they have to understand the issue is the equally important, but next client is the public. Right, and so I think we have to be cognizant of that, and the charge that the select board has given us is to have at least one public meeting. The design of that public meeting, where we talk about the timing of that, is going to evolve, and we're gonna need your input to figure out exactly what that meeting is and what the topic is and when that should occur. So that's yeah, that's sort of on the in the future. Just want to kind of throw that out there. Rich,
How much more definition do you need of uses? The previous report lays out what 6 or 7 different uses, from housing through community activities to civic, municipal use, and ends with bird watching. But within each of those, there's obviously a big difference. I mean, if you build a hospice, the risk of any residual radiation killing somebody is less, however low it is, than if you have family housing. So do you need more detail on each of those scenarios before you can advise us?
Really, where we need the most detail, and I think that the area's been pretty well set in terms of the broad buckets of evaluation are a residential, right, or a sort of commercial use. And so it's really just the boundaries of those uses, and that could potentially change our evaluation. But those are, broadly the categories that I would be interested in.
But even within commercial, there's a huge range, it's one thing if you have a gym to which everybody comes every day. It's something else if you have a lot of workers the same all the time, something else if it's people who only come very rarely. So that, I'm trying to figure out the chicken and
I
the
think
egg.
he's talking about the assumption thing.
Yeah, and so usually what we would do in those sort of scenarios, we would for a commercial, like for a gym situation, we would assume a worker at the gym. Right? So we would assume. the
But
workspace-
you need to assume a gym rather than a, council on aging facility. Or, you know, what was it, the incubator space. When it was one.
But-
Floated.
Not necessarily, what they're saying is if you assume the most conservative
Yeah,
case,
right.
the worker who's there every day, if it's safe for them, then it's gonna be safe for somebody who's there more occasionally.
And there are.
So depending on the assumptions you make about that use.
Right.
Absolutely, go ahead.
On this issue, I was wondering, it seems like the risk is a function of the use.
Yeah.
And the location that's within the site. So I think in some sense, the risk assessment would help inform the ultimate reuse plan or scenarios and that. I don't know if you're thinking of doing this, but it would be helpful, I think, to have almost like a matrix for each zone or sub areas and each use,
Yes,
the risk assessment, as opposed to like a single scenario of the whole site.
yeah.
Go, I think you-
I love this guy.
Yeah.
That's
That's
I
a
mean,
great idea.
That's, I mean, that, we talk about that, that's kind of the,
But if you go to the next slide.
to analyze it, it is looking at the various
Yeah,
reviews. and
it's
various things
where
around
these
that.
things come together.
Are you changing the slide?
Yes, you can.
No, Chris, that's good.
I think we both have to do it because
Oh,
this is, yeah.
I don't know,
It's for the world, but
you're ready to go after my screen, but. Well,
will your work be submitted to and approved by EPA or is it kind of a separate track?
No, separate.
There's
Usually
something
it was
different on the
something
screen.
that so generally, right, so we rely heavily on RACs, USDA, risk assessment guidance. Using standardized methodology.
But the town is.
I'm viewing Chris.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
you are representing.
Why am I seeing your screen?
Yeah.
Just minimize the do, pull up the PowerPoint.
You know, implicit in what you're saying is you're not gonna be
Okay,
coming to
got it,
town
got it.
specifying more data that's required. You're confident you can rely on everything that's been generated if you have access to it. That's your working assumption.
In part, we intend to look at areas that are not planned for remediation to ensure that we're comfortable that those areas do pass this threshold, right? Because they're not remediating the entire footprint of the site. So we will look at data to ensure that we're comfortable that no response action is needed in that area that we're implementing. Or if there are other data gaps that we identify, certainly bring that to the attention.
Is just a logistic note, my screen cannot see the participants on the Zoom, so if there's anybody from the public who has a comment, we can reserve that after the committee speaks anyway, right? So, but I can't see you, so hold up raising your hand until we're done with the presentation.
I will also note, just be the further response to your question, often, based on my experience, the people that are trying to clean up the site, they're trying to clean up the site, they're not necessarily thinking about the site for use. And, the full characterization of data, so often, Ariel and I get a data set, we take a look at it, and we say, yikes. They missed this over here, so we're gonna be taking a really, really close look at the data. Making sure that we feel comfortable with the way that we're providing our recommendations.
But we're not collecting any.
No, we are not collecting more
We are
data,
not.
but we will
Right.
highlight if we see an issue.
And that communication, I'm assuming, would be coordinated with Paul and with somebody on town staff.
We have a whole separate committee.
Okay.
that is
So,
Okay,
yeah,
as long as that gets worked out.
we'll work that out.
So we could ask for clarification or further investigation into something that raised a flag for you. Am I reading that correctly?
I would hope.
Yeah.
You're not like taking it and saying, here's the data and what we're gonna.
We will let you know, and that's part of our process, as Ariel and I start to assess things. We call it to each other's attention, hey, I don't like the way that this data was collected. You know, it looks like they didn't collect deep enough.
And we're hopeful, there have been a lot of eyes on this project.
Yes, I could.
We're hopeful that's not an issue, but we look at it because it's part of our process.
And as we're dealing with the public and the board of selectmen, we need to know that those questions have been asked and answered.
Yes,
Understood.
Yeah.
By people who know what they were looking at.
yes.
Understood.
So there's obviously a real challenge on this aspect of the project. It's like the time machine. Because we're trying to project the site as it's going to be when it's cleaned up, when it can't be reused. Prior to that, we have to recommend to the select board, are we gonna get there? Because by the end of next year, it's not gonna all be cleaned up, so the data you're gonna collect in September of next year is not gonna show it's clean.
Yeah.
But you know, you guys are gonna have to project along with Pam's committee and others' eyes on the site, where this thing is heading, what assurance we have it's going to be cleaned up.
Yeah.
Because the data you're gonna end up with next fall is not the final data set.
Mhm.
Okay?
Yeah.
You all know that, but I just,
Totally
yeah,
understand.
yeah, it's a challenge.
It is a challenge.
It's complicated.
And that's, you know, there's a trust, you have looked at this. The Max is heading in the right direction, they're doing the right thing, if that's the conclusion. So, I mean, that's really the challenge, it's sort of
So we,
spending time.
right, we're not waiting for the cleanup to be completed in order to make a conclusion, right? So we have to somewhere along the way, make assumptions that they will achieve this cleanup goal for this compound in this area.
Right.
At this depth, at this location.
And you'll talk a lot more later on how you're gonna do that, but not tonight, but as you do your work. Go ahead, next slide, sorry.
So, did you finish what you wanted to talk about?
Oh,
No,
yeah,
Sidetrack.
yeah, thanks, Ariel.
So this is just one example of how we might distill, the results of the human health risk assessment. This shows the, reuse areas, example, exposure scenarios. We're using colors and other notations to kind of demonstrate the results. So it distills down, the numerical results into something that's a little bit more digestible. You can identify, areas and scenarios similar to what you're speaking to. I believe.
And it can also be flipped the other way, where it's areas and uses that would be acceptable,
Mhm.
point, right?
Yeah.
So
this is already incorporating all the work that the review committee did to identify different areas.
So we selected the 3 scenarios, but really we understand that some of those are in flux. So we will, with the past committee and other folks, determine what are the 3 scenarios that we want to evaluate.
Well, and that's the logical interface, this subgroup with the reuse subgroup. By the way, the reuse subgroup is Gary and Rich. Yeah. Well, I think you have that matrix, but matrix upon a matrix. Should I go to the next slide?
Yes, please. So then we have the, potential future work, and that's, presenting the findings of the human health risk assessment to the town select board, taking that feedback and finalizing the human health risk assessment, and then working with the committee, subgroup and the committee to develop a public engagement strategy, and then executing that public engagement strategy.
What about ecological risks?
We have not.
I'm sorry, what's
What
the
about ecological risks?
Good question. We have not.
We do ecological risk.
We could look at it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't part of
It's not part of our scope.
Right, there are areas of the site that are just being cleaned up to be ecological goals and not green health goals, because they are wetlands that supposedly would have no.
The ball. Yeah, sure.
if the backbench is going to go, need to shout.
Okay.
For Terry and others, I'm sorry.
So Terry, I pointed out that, there are places on the site that are just being cleaned up to meet ecological goals. Because they don't have any human access, because they're wetlands, that won't be places where people could build or live.
Like there are a few wetland areas and then the bog, I believe, that would, yeah. The bog primarily.
Okay, so let's have the discussion for next 15 minutes or so. Rich, feel it.
Maybe I need more education, but when you're talking about calculating relative risk, that's between uses, obviously. but you also compare it with the risk of normal human activity and, you know, yes, there's a risk, but it's less than being eaten by a killer whales from the Walden Pond or something like that.
Right, so the way that the risk estimates are expressed is, and it's just a convention of the way that we attack human health risk assessment, but non-cancer risk. Which is, you know, the risk of developing some sort of neurological issue, right? Non-cancer risk, and cancer risk. And so cancer risk is more easy to understand for most people because it's kind of that 1 in a million type of risk. And the non-cancer risk is harder to try to unpack and explain to people in more of that relative term. But it's just, you know, if the risk estimate falls below 1, which is, you know, determined to be acceptable by regulatory criteria, then there's no, you know, unacceptable level of non-cancer risk. It's very hard to say technically.
It's very
Yeah.
technical.
I know,
Yeah.
but
Sure.
pretty much, yeah.
I was just gonna suggest, I don't know if it's within your current scope, but it may be useful for this group and also the public to have like a risk assessment 101 workshop to explain how the risk assessment process works before you get into specific concepts of redevelopment and the actual risks. Because it is a complicated process and some of the concepts are hard and not necessarily intuitive.
And I think that could address the question, why are we even doing this assessment if the goals look like they're so commendable and they're gonna get us to a place where we've got potable water and so on. People are gonna ask us why we need this extra layer. So I think that'll help address it.
We're not getting to potable water.
Well,
We have institutional control.
no, I understand that,
Yeah.
but what it's, but
I understand.
But our documents say we're gonna reach that level, but we're not gonna need to reach that level for human use, but we're gonna reach it anyway. Which I think would bring forth the question, why the additional experts coming in to do assessment? Are we not gonna meet those cleanup goals?
That's a good question.
Well, it could be the inference on the part of members of the
That's right.
public.
So there are cleanup goals for the different media. Right, so we're looking at more holistically. The human beings exposure to all of the chemicals. In any given location via all exposure. Maybe Katie could explain this in a better way, but I think we're looking more cumulative risk as opposed to individual cleanup goals from an individual compound at a given location.
I want to go back to Kurt's comment about ecological risk for a moment, because we kind of blocked over that very quickly. I think when we spoke to the select board, when we got the charge from the select board and we heard what their concerns were, we were definitely focused on reuse and human health. But are we missing something? And this may be a question for Terry and the select board. But is there a need to assure the public that the ecology is
Can I ask, I mean, reading over their proposal, they just described in their presentation, tasks 1, 2, and 3. There's also tasks 4, 5, and 6, which are not funded. Could it be task 7, which is not funded? Can you just explain a little bit about what's funded, what's not funded? And
Sure, what's funded right now are the first 3 tasks, document review, site investigation, communication with stakeholders, and the bulk of it, the meat of that is the draft human health use risk assessment. That's what's been funded. And the proposed task would be engagement with the select board on it, receive, review their comments, incorporation of their comments, and finalizing our document. And then engaging the public. So that's future.
Yeah, I think, and let's table the issue of ecological risk. You're right, there could be something in the future, but is that something the select board wants to be part of the recommendation? That's sort of my question, and I can't answer that. Speak to the select board. It really did come up explicitly in the charge.
And one of the reasons I raise it is because of the value of the bog as an ecological resource, and that's one of the core components of reuse and redevelopment, ensuring that use is protected.
Great.
And also because of the issue of groundwater to surface water discharge potentially in that area, which I don't know if it's an issue, but it's one of my open questions that I have.
Any other comments? Questions?
Yeah, Richard's question made it occur to me that another way to think about relative risk is, things are getting built in Concord all the time, homes are getting built, apartments, offices. And is it possible to compare the risk of a use on this site or residing in this site with human exposure risk at another location in Concord where by right we're allowed to do some of these things?
An office on Baker Ave versus an office on.
Yeah,
I can't encourage us enough to be wary of that approach. The probably opening truth of risk communication is that risk comparisons are a risky business. Because they feel different based on their nature. One causes cancer and one causes hangnails. The numbers could be the same. The outcome may change. But if it's imposed on, there's a whole language of risk that is not embodied in the numbers, that if we get too, we have to use the numbers, we have to use them. Absolutely, we need people to understand risk assessment, toxicology, dose of exposure, and all of those things. But if we get too reliant speaking that language, we will be missing the language that people are speaking that we're trying to reach, because that's not the language they use. They use an emotional language. The definition of risk in the book, forgive me for going into this, is the chance of something bad happening. They use dictionary words. The chance is the calculation. The bad is the feeling. The bad is subjective. And witness the fact that you separate cancer and non-cancer. Witness that right there.
Right.
There's a reason for that, and it's not just statistical. It's not just data. It's fear. So I caution us. We have to use numbers. You're absolutely right. You're right, Kurt. We have to understand the process of risk assessment. That's so that they trust what you guys say. That was a word that was used earlier. And that will speak even more loudly than the numbers we said.
I wasn't necessarily saying to do it in a quantitative way. But I think, almost in an emotional way, or in a contextual way. We're allowing people to build certain things in certain places. People are going ahead and doing activities there. If we do the same thing at this other site, how does that compare to what we're allowing elsewhere?
It's a fair thing to incorporate into all of our thinking. Absolutely. I don't mean to be negative about it, just to be cautious about it.
Yeah.
So I want to bring up a term that we've discussed before. It's a little bit of the third rail of some community, that's safety. The safety. So people will ask me, is it safe to go on the site? Now I know risk is a component of that, but it almost makes sense to me, kind of moving forward, to talk about this is safe. And David has instructed me, how do you, it's subjective. And I said, well, if you tell people this is how I've come to that conclusion, there's all the information behind it, including risk assessment. Therefore, it's safe to do this, it's safe to say. So what's your thinking of word safety and risk as a communication tool?
So I think that we had talked about this briefly and we kind of talked about it together as a team. And there is this tension between what's technically correct and the math and the science, and then the risk communication piece. So I think a nice way to approach it is to say, the site is safe for this use based on the results of the risk assessment. Or presented the other way, based on the results of the risk assessment, the site is safe for use.
We had a back and forth about this last time we met, and I think that having a binary approach to safe and unsafe is really not wise or honest. And I think your formulation is the right one. Whatever we say, something is safe. We say based on certain assumptions up to a certain point, as far as we know. I would not want this group to ever say anything the same without saying
contextually under what conditions and on what basis we do that. So I know it's very, to me, it's very important that we not be binary and reductive in some, in a situation like this. I just want to commend you for saying what you said about how to deal with that word, say.
Yeah, I really think we're in violent agreement.
Yay,
Yeah, I mean,
that's wonderful.
if you use those terms, you have to have it to the back of the information. Nobody, yeah, it's like, it can't be subjective, it has to be based on data, information, analysis. Standard practice has to be based, has to be built on that, but the open communication, the public, you know. One time set to -6 number or second, you know, how we translate that number into a.
The other option is to say, there's acceptable risk. Because that's what it is, right? It's acceptable risk, but I know that doesn't apply, but that's what safe means, right? There's acceptable risk,
Yeah.
because there's a risk inherent with everything.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
One of your tasks you said was to contact key stakeholders,
To engage with, communicate.
engage with,
Yes.
yeah. So one of the things, my little corner is obviously this communication issue. And I've been talking to the people who are far more knowledgeable about the whole history of this than I. About who in the town. Not in this room and not in government and not in official government. I've talked to Pam some about this, Paul, are the stakeholder people of concern, not of concern, that sounds negative, of whose concerns we need to be aware of and respect. And is that part of your investigation or not under your limited funds? And, you know, how do we job share that responsibility? What I'm trying to find out.
I think that could be part of the engagement with the community, one of the future tasks is developing that strategy. Who are the key people we engage with? What are their key concerns? What are the top list of things that we need to address and hit? And really.
But that's not funded today, right? What's funded
That's
today
not funded today.
is just preparing an initial slide deck that presents the relative risk.
It's more than that. It's preparing a draft reuse risk assessment.
I think my larger question really is, Paul, like, are there plans for EPA or a bubble tag grant, or, because when I was reading your proposal, like, task 4, 5, and 6 seem like our real goal. And none of that's funded.
Well,
I mean, not to minimize, task 1, 2, and 3 is critical and necessary, but not sufficient. So I'm just.
What I know about this topic is that there's far more effort needed than what's presently in their scope. When and if that's expanded, it's not the committees, we can make a recommendation for that. And I think we will go for renewal of the tag grant, but the expansion of that using other funds outside the tag grant. We can't speak for that. Perhaps others in town can, and maybe they want to or may not want to. But there are other things that probably need to get done before October 31st of next year. Beyond those 3 tasks to help us out. Chris Carmody, you want to address that?
Yeah, so we started conversations with DEP about the fiscal 24 tag grant cycle, and they're open to the idea of the town applying, but they're still getting a sense for what we've done so far. So there's a little bit of a calculus to see what we've done to date. Yeah, and so there's no discussion going on.
So
I think we as a task force are free to recommend to the town and select board that there's something we need. And it's that we don't have the funds, but we can make a recommendation, something, if there's a gap.
And Megan's window here, the tag grant did not cover the entirety of the contract. So there was a $18,000 contribution from the town for tax 1 through 3. Okay.
yeah, I mean, I don't know that we need tasks 4, 5, 6, and 7, but I think there was at least one task in there that really, as part of our charge, and I should stay out of it, it's really you. But I mean, you know, looking at what is in our charge of your work stream, it seemed to me that like at least one of those tasks was going to be a pretty critical element, and maybe we can do it as a committee on our own, but have.
Well, let me interject. In terms of finding out who the folks are in town who have what concerns, I just assumed that was kind of, that fell under my responsibility. It felt like, I don't need to hire anybody to do that. I need to do it. I need to have those.
No, developing a, but you're developing a plan.
Oh, yes, that
addressing those
comes back here.
concerns.
That comes back here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say is if we want a consultant to look at something, we need to be able to define it really, really well. And get it into language that works in a contract. But I think part of what is being raised here is an emotional response and not the scientific. If we as representatives of the community have been brought to this table, we will rely on information from the experts that we're paying for those studies. But at some point, we need to be able to interpret that, and how is the community, how are the board of selectmen and the public, if it ends up at the town meeting discussion, going to react? We need to anticipate what those questions are and be able to respond to them, whatever our recommendation ends up being. I think we're the meter of public opinion.
Well, on that point, let me be,
The select, board have requested that in their.
Exactly.
let me be a little explicit. David and Kurt are sort of on the hook to put together a work plan. Here are the things we need to do, and then you guys need to figure out where to get that information. Do we need a consultant? Can we get it on our own? Can we have our own engagement? So these work plans that we have to put together will define what, how we're going to interact with the town council, with SKIO, with RU, and, and what we do on our own. So, it's in development, and you're all raising good points that we have to cover all the bases. Yeah, does that make sense?
We can't ignore that piece.
Absolutely.
I have a separate question. What's the schedule to complete tasks 1 through 3? Like, when can we expect to see the draft human health risk assessment? Not to put you on the spot, but if we're looking a year out from October, we need to kind of know how this fits into the overall process.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I don't want to give you a set date until I take a look at the data.
That's fair.
It's just from experience, I've confirmed on that in the past, so. I would say, probably a couple of months. But I really do need to take a look at the data before giving a firm date.
Okay, is there no further questions or comments? I'd like to thank you guys, like Ariel, Nancy, Kat, for coming by. We'll have plenty of opportunity to work together some more. Starting tomorrow at the.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's right. You're there for the water. It's not,
Are you gonna stay for the rest of this meeting? Because I'm gonna discuss the site visit.
We definitely want to hear the site visit piece.
Okay. What I'd like to do is switch gears a little bit right now. And go over the economic matrix work plan. That Carl sent to get some initial feedback, not a robust discussion, because we're gonna have a separate session on that one. But Carl did provide, it's in your work packet, but let me share that, and then after that discussion, I'll get to the site visit. We have minutes to approve and we got enough time. Let me. Here, I want to find print, but you want to just. You have copies of this, and it's, they're good, just open a discussion about what you've done.
Sure.
What kind of feedback you're looking for.
Sure, so after the meeting, when Harry and I took on this task, I sort of took it upon myself to say, okay, how do I think we could tackle this as a work group, and what does this work stream include? So I went back to the charge to kind of identify what I call issues or questions in the charge that I thought were within our scope. And then for each of those, as I thought about the operations economic activity, it seemed to make sense to divide it. We're talking about cost for long-term operation of the site, to divide it into sort of capital costs. And operating costs. And then, to create categories. Around each of those costs, in some cases. The category was very explicit in the charge, so for example, in the charge, they ask us to look at. What are the costs to comply with federal and state? What do we need to do to comply with federal and state regulations? So understanding what those are and understanding the costs for them. And then, I figured there might be other capital costs, so I kind of just created a catch-all category for those. And then, how are we gonna fund that? What are the options and approaches to funding that? And a similar thing for the operating costs. They charge calls out insurance needs. What are their costs? We're gonna have towns gonna own the site and perhaps some infrastructure. What do we need to maintain that and service that? How do we manage the institutional controls? What are the costs? Ongoing operating costs for that, and then what are the funding options? And then I kind of broke down each of those into more specific tasks that I thought were going to be needed to do. And then what would be the potential information sources that we could draw on to get the information we need to complete those tasks. And then ultimately, what would we try and produce for each of those items? So that was kind of how I approached it. I mean, I didn't approach this really any differently than I'm a consultant, so I had an RFP in front of us, and I had to put together, a budget for each, and how would I begin to tackle it and sort of frame out the work. So
It definitely had the feel of a consultant. I think it's brilliant. Not only this lays out sort of your thinking in the areas you have to cover, but it's almost like an outline for a section of the final report. Consultants also think about what the final report's gonna look like. These topics have to be covered, and I'm just, maybe that's kind of.
I wasn't thinking about it.
I know you, but I'm looking at these, boy, that's a good section in the final report. It doesn't have to be like that. I think these cover on the basis, so. I wanted to discuss that today, not in great detail. We can go into these. I think we're gonna have a lot to talk about institutional controls, because that's evolving. I've sent you some more information that Bruce Thompson provided on those, which will be kind of fodder for more conversation tomorrow on a side visit. But this was a good template that I shared with the legal group and others. So suggesting. Any comments on this? Yes, go ahead.
So I thought, I agree, it's a great template, and I was intrigued by the last column, which in several critical rows says partly depends on how the site is developed, partly depends on the uses.
Right.
As Rich and I are working to develop a work plan for the reuse work stream.
Yeah.
I was thinking, well, the uses are gonna partly depend upon the costs, and do we have a chicken and egg part?
But I think,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it sort of leads to what the necessary baseline is. If all we do is apply it, or is there even no argument in favor of that when we look at things? And then you can pile on to that what happens with various uses that may be or maybe not suitable. It may be something that would be desirable in the long run and might be safe 50 years from now, but it's not reasonable in terms of cost and benefit right away. So I'm sort of looking at it over a long timeline that we can talk about, but I love the way you put this together and the fact that it just raises, one question always leads to another.
Right, I think it's ultimately gonna be iterative.
Yeah.
Really well.
Iterative.
Oh, yeah.
What you may come up.
We can develop
with
a list of uses
a
that may
use,
be dependent
right.
on costs, and we'll have that
We
information.
may have to start with some uses and look at that. If the cost ended up being prohibitive. In terms of financial goals of the town, then we might go back and refine the reuse plan. Or, it may be that, well, are there other ways to accomplish some of these costs other than the town taking responsibility for it. I mean, one issue that this brought to my mind that I didn't put my scope for this for our group, and I wasn't sure if we're going to reuse, so but sort of, how does the town go about implementing, if it acquires the site and it has a set of desired new uses to bring about, some of which are not going to be, built by the town and operated by the town. How does it bring those about? Does, in real estate, you could think of there's sort of the horizontal development and the vertical development. And, you could, sometimes you have a master developer who takes responsibility for the sort of horizontal development. And then you convey sites, to other developers or users to build the vertical development. So will the town operate sort of as a master developer and break it up into specific sites and then solicit proposals into those sites? Or will the town look for a master developer or go into a partnership with a master developer? I mean, I think those implementation issues around reuse are something we're gonna have to think about and make recommendations. I didn't include it in this scope. I don't know if it's the reuse plan scope, but it is something we're gonna have to figure out, where to address.
Gary, would it be possible to frame ultimately in your mind, we have a question of whether to acquire and then what kind of reuse to use if we do. Marry the iterative problem of chicken and egg and cost. Here are some possible reuses and here are the costs.
Yeah,
As opposed to thou shalt do A.
yeah, and I think it also ties into safety.
Correct.
Here are some, and I would actually reformulate the matrix you have, rather than by 3 scenarios. I like the way you were framing it, I know each scenario had the, A1, A2, but I think we want to frame the matrix entirely by the reuse zones. And so for each zone, what are the potential uses for that zone? And I think similarly that, what's the safety, what's the cost of using, a zone for various uses? And that will give, I think, the Chinese menu that the town can then,
I think our charge is to kind of come up with our sense of what priorities are, but we need to be solely just one.
And there's actually a lower baseline, which is not required, but does that open us up to this?
Well, again, we're living in the matrix here. Matrix upon matrix, but it's really, that's why all these pieces are connected.
Can I ask one question about the
I will say one thing, I personally don't think that we can recommend this, like, where, let's say if we, yes, you should acquire this without saying why. At least the baseline of why. Because I know the members of the select board that really need that information, what needs does it satisfy in the town? No, that's big need for housing, affordable housing, big need for recreation. Those needs have to kind of percolate up and drive. Hopefully drive the need, and then the constraint is the liability, the constraints. It's driven by opportunity, constrained by financial and legal issues. That's where I kind of look at it. Maybe incorrect, but it's all iterative.
I just had one question about the otherwise brilliant organizational approach to the economic. I was looking for areas that might be in addition to what's on the list. So we're responsible for the site. But there are institutional controls and implications for people off the site based on what is going on the site. Right? And who's responsible for what's going on the site. So let's say the town acquires it and is responsible for keeping that well going and not clogged up, and all of a sudden the hockey rink wants more water. Making a wild scenario. Is there anything that we need to add in our thinking about the economic implications of acquisition in terms of what the economic implications would be to the town in its relationship with those off-site partners? Yeah, neighbors or whatever, businesses, there might be costs that we're imposing on other people to do stuff.
I think we have.
I don't know whether that needs to go in the chart.
I think we have to understand if there's a legal Like, each of the owners of the sites have to sign their own notice of activity of use limitation for nulls. The town has to sign it for the 2229. The issue of all the other sites are treatment systems on that site, not use of groundwater on that site. So there's I don't know if there are those connections to worry about. Which I don't.
Me either, I just, one area that I didn't see on the list.
So I think we have to have the town council look at it, we have to ask EPA and Maximus about the responsibility. But it's intriguing, when I read Bruce's document on the IC plan. I saw 5 different properties all needing nulls, and I said, whoa, is the town responsible for all those? And he said, no, town's responsible for 229 Main Street, and the other owners are responsible for those. Our burden on institutional controls is a little bit higher because we have to protect the cap. We can't dig in soils. Plus, we have to protect systems and we can't take groundwater. So we have all those. The other sites don't have all those institutional controls. So Longwood is saying, I don't believe there are those worrisome
But I
issues.
think, you
But
know,
we have to confirm that.
I mean, you know, just to speculate on something, you could say, you know, new development at that site. Could increase traffic, that abutters or other neighborhoods could then be concerned about the traffic impacts, as they could advocate for, you know. Some improvements or some activity, but I think it's hard to know what those will be and quantify them.
Yeah, I'm still about the institutional controls. I'm talking about.
I was talking about.
Other issues and those are real.
Yeah, those are vague but real.
Right.
I was talking
Yeah.
about the legal responsibility level ones, but it's worth just checking off that.
I mean, I
box.
think one thing we can do is, as we have discussions with stakeholders in public meetings and see what concerns and issues get surfaced, that might give us some clues or some direction as to those other costs that we might want to think about or consider.
So I do want to get into this, a deeper dive on that, but I think it was a really nice start. On that, and again, good template, but.
Ask a related question, not about his chart, but about, you know, for the reuse options track. I'd love to have a work plan like that also, or something that defines our work stream, and I do have this wonderful, I know, Kat is still online. SKIO 2 meetings ago said, we would love to develop a draft action plan and timeline for the legal track and the reuse options track, and I missed last meeting, I'm sorry, but was that kind of shelved or tabled, or? Is
No, I
SKIO
think-
able to help us with?
Well, Steve asked me specifically, you know, are we launching? And I said, well, let's wait for this initial phase. And let the work groups get organized and then get moving. So I think this is sort of, get moving, you know, work plans, you know, do the interactions. I think we need to keep track of the coordination and, you know, the conversations, but
Yeah.
I don't want to speak.
Well, Rich and I are meeting
Yeah.
tomorrow, but we'll.
Can we
reach out.
approach them directly through you,
Yeah.
through the town?
I think you should approach
Email.
them directly.
We had an email. chain
Yeah,
of
they
routes.
volunteer.
I do not want to be in the middle of.
Oh, so we can-
I'd like to know what's going on, but,
But we'll probably use Carl's template, forward that to Robbie
Yeah.
and make sure.
Yeah. and you know, the idea is kind of bring back to this group, you know, what you guys are doing, get feedback, and then. You know, and then have periodic. Rethink, so things are gonna evolve, all the matrices and coordination issues that we're talking about, they're gonna become real. Over time, as we get more information. We move to the next topic. So the next topic is the site visit. I have, I prepared a folder for you, so. Bruce Thompson has a presentation tomorrow. And the site visit is gonna be our task force, PAMS committee, tonight, Main Street Oversight Committee. Folks from RU will be there, folks from the town will be there. It's an open meeting in the public. So there may be members of the public there. I gave Bruce a heads up to expect 30 or 40 people, maybe. He said, fine, it's great. I think he's gonna give a little presentation. Maybe more than a little, and then we'll walk on the site. And I want to cover all of the areas of the site, up on the hill, et cetera, so want everybody to get a good feeling for the physical aspects of the site, but then drill into some of the issues that the Max was dealing with, some of the technical issues. The presentation is somewhat technical, not as technical as some of the other ones panel we've seen, because you know, they can get really into like. Into the, I want, big picture stuff, and then have you guys ask questions, I know. And I sent the questions that you posed to me, I sent those to Bruce. So he's anticipating some of the questions on contamination. I've asked him to specifically, we have these reuse zones, and then we have areas of interest. How do the AOIs and the areas, the reuse areas, how they overlap? The packet I have here for you has, and this will be in the meeting packet. It has some excerpts you can carry around the job. It has sort of the master plan, which is sort of the thinking of the reuse committee on, you know, no matter what we did, here's kind of the master plan. And then it has the listing of the AOIs on it. And it has a topo map, so you can kind of walk around. Because I find when I walk around, I'm gonna fix the scribble on. So you can grab one of these that you need.
Pass them around.
Yeah, we're good shoes. I don't know how muddy the site's gonna be, it's been raining a bit, as you've noted. And each time I go to the site, they're doing something different, they're digging different areas. So we're not gonna be bushwhacking, but it could be, you wanna wear open toe sandals. Just like I'm wearing today. We're meeting at 1 p.m. and probably an hour and a half, and it's for all of you to get educated and ask questions, so.
Where are we meeting?
We're meeting at the site.
I've never been at this.
Okay, go in and immediately on the
Is
left,
there a place to go?
you know where the address is.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so go in there, take the first left, and the trailer, there's a little parking area, it's right at the entrance. We'll meet at that trail, that's where they have an office. They'll give you the presentation, and we'll keep on Bruce will tour us around the whole site. Kurt,
I've been called a jury duty tomorrow. So probably won't make it. Unless they let me out of.
you can have a much better private tour than.
I went to the other one, so I did see the site about 6 weeks ago.
You're on, you caught the jury duty or on the jury or something?
Well, I need to show up for.
Oh, yeah.
Where I stick around,
Out of there.
Where were you called? District?
Newton,
District?
I don't remember.
That was the district. District, so by about 10:30 or 11, the lawyers who haven't settled will determine whether this trial for you to sit on. Roughly by 11:30, they'll know whether they can send you on.
Okay.
Do you know?
It may not speak at all, but
Just in case.
Cell phone number.
Yeah.
617-513-1351. And now anybody wants the video, they can have to get in touch with me.
yeah, what are your passwords?
Yeah.
So I wanted to point out that this is a joint site visit with the 259 Main Street Committee, and a big portion of why it's a joint visit and a joint meeting is so that everyone on this committee can ask questions of anybody they're walking around with and pick up some of the history and what's going on when they have particular questions. It's supposed to, you know, our joint opportunity to get as many of us together at the same time, to chat about this.
And both committees have posted their meetings, so this is a public meeting, two twin public meetings happening at the same time on the site, so you can.
But it is in your charge to have a joint meeting with the 229 Main Street Oversight.
Yeah.
And I thought this would actually be more productive than a meeting that only half of anybody could get to.
Okay, another Kara, questions, comments?
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. Yes. Hey, everybody. So just for tomorrow, a quick reminder, as Paul said, wear really sturdy shoes for walking around. There are a number of areas of fairly uneven ground. So be careful, especially if it's wet. And we have hard hats and safety vests on site. If you happen to own a hard hat or safety vest, we recommend you bring it. The site is actively under construction right now, so you need to wear safety gear when walking around. And I'll meet you all tomorrow in person.
Okay, last, item of business is the minutes, approval of the minutes. I know I've already got at least one comment, from Pam, but maybe if I.
Can we just send our comments to the drafter? I mean, right, I've said it, that there's like what, somebody drafts them and sends them around. And then you can just write back your comments and then they finalize that. It just,
I think that's fine, if there are, purpose here is, are we ready for approval of the minutes, if there are comments, we're not ready for approval of the minutes, so,
I think it depends on if they're just grammatical.
yeah, so is it a good comment?
There's substance.
Minor?
I sent it to you, it's minor, very minor.
Yeah, so if we could deal with minor comments here, so that we can vote on approval of the minutes, so I can make that thing.
Then that's a motion to approve with
Yeah.
Davis noted. This meeting.
Yeah, so let's, we put that. First, the May 30th meeting, I think your comment was on May 30th meeting.
Yeah, I merely said that I had not suggested the stream.
Sorry.
For, all that.
I think it said the third, it said Ms. Hill asked if there should be a separate work stream to explore acquisition ports of the site.
And I think I thought I said that I was just querying whether we, should consider acquisition. of
You weren't
parcels.
recommending a separate work stream.
Exactly, that's it.
So that's the,
And I sent you my suggested language, so, because you asked. for it.
on that sentence.
Yeah, I sent your subsequent email back with exact language.
But that's the nature of it.
Oh, yeah, that's enough, right, right.
I don't have, pull up my email on top of this,
No, no,
my
no.
screen will explode.
Pam, do you have those in front of you now? Can you just reword that sentence and propose it? You want to move forward with it?
I think I can go ahead and move that we accept the
Yeah, why-
minutes of May 30th as amended.
Absolutely, I second that, yes.
Okay, perfect. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. May 30th meeting, minutes are accepted. June 13th. Any comments on June 13th?
I had a question about that, and I think the answer is no, but should we give Mina a chance to look at that? And that was summarizing a legal presentation where some statements were made that may or may not have been absolutely correct, and I would be much more comfortable if he looked at that and said, this is exactly what I said. But I don't know what the etiquette is with that. I don't know how you want to handle it. I made me uneasy that we were.
Well, I don't think it's worth a legal opinion, we're discussing.
No, I know.
work streams. I don't think that's necessary.
I would,
If
the
he,
record, I'd be more comfortable.
yeah, if he was offering some opinion, like.
No, but this is a public hearing that what the lawyer for the town was saying, I would probably, if I were sharing this, be inviting him to come. But you know, it's your call, I'm easier, but you know.
Unless somebody feels strongly otherwise, I'm going to decline that opportunity.
My opinion, as a non-lawyer, is that this is what we understood him to say. And if that turns out to be wrong later on,
Yeah.
it will probably come
That's
up later on.
absolutely right.
It's
That's
video.
exactly, it's just, yeah.
Okay, no, I appreciate it, comment. Just as, okay, look, do I have a motion to approve the June 13th minutes?
So,
Second. All in favor? Okay. It's approved. Just a comment on, maybe Terry wants to, well, I'll open this up to comment, but I was gonna say that I know that Mina is, trying to get his work going, he's approaching the select board and getting a budget for that, along the lines of what we talked about. I don't know. Terry, do you want to say anything more about the process of town council moving forward?
No, no, that's correct, Paul. we're waiting for Mina's work plan. And he'll be discussing it with Carrie in terms of the budget. And then Carrie wants him to come to the select board because we haven't budgeted yet for this. So we need to have a little discussion with him and figure out how we're going to do it.
By the way, this is relevant for me important, the work plan to which you're referring is what I understood he was gonna deliver with a kind of pathway for the various things they were going to do for us.
Yeah, he had,
Is that your understanding, Jerry? 'Cause that, I think, Court and I are very dependent on that.
okay.
Well,
he
It
had-
sounded like it's summary at the end of the minutes. He said there are 3 next steps.
Well,
Right.
Except there was more than one.
Yeah, there's 4
Or maybe-
tasks. There are 4 tasks he's going to be working on. Pam,
I
you
thought it
and
was really one, no.
we could talk offline if you want to go over what 4 tasks are.
Yeah, I thought it was gonna be more fleshed out, that's all. I thought the 4 tasks would be broken out into more detail.
Well, they will be.
And that would be the frame that we would be using if they were broken out in greater detail.
Right. That's what we're waiting for from Mina. That's right.
Or maybe we should talk offline and Jerry. just so
Okay.
I- Or, I mean, you agree?
Yeah, you're looking at the work plan, has to be consistent with what he thinks is his work plan, but then.
Yeah, and I think the question is, how granular is he gonna get? And I assume he's gonna be more than what we saw in the.
Yeah, we're hoping the very fact that he has to put together a budget obligates him to put together some detail that,
Correct.
that you and I can build on
Yeah.
for our piece of it.
Yeah, more than 3 4.
Yeah, but you know the basic construct of the thing.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's the
Okay.
devil's in the details, okay. So that's a bit of an update on that. Any other comments from anybody else on Zoom?
Well, I just wanted to comment a couple of things. I think that this committee is off to an excellent start. A lot of energy, a lot of work so far. Very impressive and very organized. So thank you for everybody. Also, unfortunately, I'm still traveling. Thanks for accommodating us on Zoom. And I'm so disappointed to miss the site visit tomorrow. If there's any way that that's either going to be recorded or if there's a makeup meeting for anybody who can't go tomorrow from either committee, I'd be interested in attending at that point. I went to a site visit about 2 years ago, so I think I'm due for another one.
Yeah, I remember watching the side of it, but it's changed a lot, so, and I know Kurt's gonna want to have a private tour at some point.
Yes.
Unless he gets in a long trial. We won't see him for long. Okay, noted. Last thing I want to talk about is so we have 2 meetings in July. In structuring the agenda for that, I'd like to start digging into some of these work streams and the logical pairs that I thought should be scheduled. A discussion 2 of those on one meeting and 2 of those on the other. And then you guys flush out exactly what those discussions are. I want to leave that open ended, so we're here to exchange information to help you flesh that out. So I was thinking of doing. Well, it may take a little time for me to get his budget, so maybe we do the reuse and risk work streams
I think that's a good idea.
in the first meeting, the 8 o'clock meeting in July. And then the 7:30 meeting to do the economic operations and the legal pathway. How you want to prepare for that and how you want to lead the discussion of the work groups. We're here to help you. And
I suppose this will sort of disclose the chicken egg problem a lot. So I think I see a lot of chicken and egg stuff, or you put a better matrix, perhaps it's
I do.
higher.
the chickens are just scraps.
Well, yeah, and matrix sounds more. Anyway, I think that we're gonna discover that there is a lot of figuring out, what you need before you do something else.
The major topic on the reuse, we haven't discussed, how deeply, how detailed is that, how deep, what does it have to be? To, report the select board, chat about that, yeah, lots of questions. Okay, so you basically have those, so we have those on the calendar. Any other business tonight?
Oh, look at you.
Look at that. Wow.
Very cool. Nice and tight.
That's great.
Literally within seconds.
Got a motion to adjourn, or just adjourn?
I think you can do your.
Yeah, a motion to adjourn.
Okay, well, the meeting adjourned. Thank you very much. Good meeting. Thank everybody on Zoom. I see you guys tomorrow.